Hello, my name is Andrew Friedman. I'm a senior fellow with the Human Rights Initiative here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I'd like to welcome you all to a fireside chat with Oleksandra Matviichuk. Oleksandra is the founder and head of the Center for Civil Liberties in Kyiv, Ukraine, an organization that in 2022 won the Nobel Peace Prize. The organization promotes human rights and democracy across the OSCE region and works on legislative reforms, oversight, and implements international solidarity programs along with conducting educational activities on human rights and democracy. Since 2014, when the initial Russian aggression into Crimea happened, the organization has been conducting documentation about human rights violations and war crimes taking place in the context of war. In the full-scale aggression in 2022, this was kicked into high gear, and Oleksandra and her colleagues, along with a number of other organizations, started the Tribunal for Putin initiative, which aims to document war crimes and atrocities that are taking place in preparation for eventual accountability for Russian leadership and Russian aggression. Oleksandra lives in Kyiv with her husband. Let me start and just say thank you so much for being here, Oleksandra.
Thank you for the invitation.
Let me get started and just ask you to give us a brief update about what is going on, what it's like to live in Kyiv, how your country is doing these days.
My life, like life of millions of people in Ukraine, rapidly changed after the large-scale war started, because everything which we call normal life was ruined. The possibility to go to work, to meet with your friends in cafe, to have family dinners, to hug your beloved ones, everything disappeared and crushed in 1 second. To live during the large-scale war, it means to live in total uncertainty. You can't plan not just your day, you can't plan your next several hours because you have no idea what will happen. To live during large-scale war means to live in constant fear for your beloved ones, because there is no safe place in Ukraine where you can hide from Russian rockets. But not to end to pessimistic mood, I will add that dramatic times provide us an opportunity to express the best in us, to be courageous, to fight for freedom, to make difficult but right choices, to take burden of responsibility and to help each other. And when you help in each other, in this moment, we are acutely aware what does it mean to be human.
I appreciate that, and it's so wonderful to hear that in the context of so many terrible things, so much uncertainty, as you put it, you can find moments and find things that really bring hope and really show the greatness and goodness of people. If we can move to the documentation efforts, the work that you've been doing largely since 2014, but again, full scale in 2022, I think there's a commonly held belief amongst people that when you think about justice for war, justice for aggression, justice for human rights atrocities and war crimes, that happens after the war has taken place. That happens after the guns have been silenced. In reality, that's just not the case. It's vital that these things are documented, that we see what's going on, that we're able to provide that burden of proof that's required for certain types of accountability. Can you talk a little bit about the documentation efforts, the difficulties of doing that in active full-scale war, and to the extent that you can, I understand there's sensitivities, but kind of how it's done in addition to what you're seeing?
We have been documenting war crimes in this war which Russia has launched against Ukraine for 10 years. We was the first human rights organization who sent mobile groups to Crimea, to Luhansk, to Donetsk regions to fix what happened there. And for several years, our main priority was documentation of illegal practice of detention, abduction, torture, sexual violence, and killing civilians in the occupied territories, as well as political motivated criminal prosecutions. And I personally interviewed hundreds of people who survived Russian captivity. They told me how they were beaten, raped, smashed into wooden boxes, their fingers were cut, their nails were torn away, their nails were drilled, they were electrically shocked through their genitalia. One woman told me how her eye was dug out with a spoon. When large-scale war started, this evil multiplies and intensifies in a scale and numbers, and we face with enormous amount of war crimes. And in order to be effective, we united our efforts with dozens of organizations from different regions. We built a national network of local documentators. We cover the whole country, including the occupied territories. And jointly, only for these 2 years of large-scale war, we documented more than 80,000 episodes of war crimes. And what we are doing literally, this war turned people into the numbers. So we are returning people their names, because life of each person matters.
Thank you so much for that. I think that we can agree that's the basis of what human rights should be. In situations like this, it's so easy to get lost in the scale, so easy to get lost in how prominent and how big some of these crimes and atrocities are. But your ability to return names, your ability to ensure that every person's an individual and what is committed against them is recognized is wonderful. So thank you so much for that. I wanted to ask, you touched on this a bit, but given that you've been working in this space since 2014, the sheer scale certainly changed in 2022. The geographies of these atrocities certainly changed in 2022. But have you seen other changes? Have you seen a different type of aggression, different types of atrocities, different types of tactics since the full-scale invasion in 2022, or is it more of the same, just bigger and everywhere?
Let me speak first about common features. And I will start not even with this legal invasion in Crimea. I will start with the point that all this hell which we now face in Ukraine is the result of total impunity which Russia enjoyed for decades. Russian troops committed horrible things in Chechnya, in Moldova, in Georgia, in Mali, in Libya, in Syria. They have never been punished. They believe they can do whatever they want. And when Russia annexed Crimea, it was unprecedented in our part of the world since the end of the Second World War. But the international reaction was so weak that it just encouraged Putin to go further. He was confident that he will enjoy impunity once more. So this is a common feature which shows us very important historical lesson learned that unpunished evil grows. But there is also a difference. Let me explain this with our personal experience. I was in Kyiv when Russian troops tried to circle it. I refused to evacuate, and with a part of my team, we continue our work on the ground. So when Bucha, Irpin, Matyzhin, and other key cities and settlements of Kyiv region was released, we immediately sent mobile groups to work there. And before large-scale war started, I prepared to the Russian tactics, which were cynical but pragmatic. They physically exterminate active local people. So they illegally abducted, detained, and killed priests, journalists, mayors, teachers, environmentalists, children writers, like active people of community, in order to save control over the region. But what we found in Bucha and other cities, it was different. You remember these dead bodies of men and women lay scattered around the streets until liberation. We found the same dead bodies in the gardens of their own households. We found dead bodies of people with hands tied under their backs in the mass graves. We found dead bodies in civilian cars. The whole family with children were killed while they tried to escape from the danger zone. So it's not targeting active people, it's a terror. It's something different.
Thank you for sharing that. I know that is a significant advancement, a significant growth in the horror to not be targeting individual areas or targeting individual people, just committing terror against an entire people. I'm really glad that you mentioned impunity. I mean, as we know, impunity causes war. Impunity causes aggression. It allows people who have done terrible things to think that they will never be punished for any other terrible things they do, and generally those just grow. We've seen that across the globe. We've seen that in no shortage of conflict situations. So I wanted to raise, from the impunity standpoint, I know you, with your documentation efforts, you and your organization have written a number of reports, things for the US government, things for the EU, things for the OSCE, I believe some work for the International Criminal Court as well. Justice in these situations can be a somewhat, I don't want to say malleable, but I don't have a better word for it. It's in the eye of the beholder. So justice to some people looks like prosecution. It looks like life behind bars. Justice to some people can just look like peace. There's an article I read recently where justice to some survivors of an atrocity looks like having identification cards so they can access service. I wanted to ask, what does justice look like to you?
I work with people affected by this war directly, and I know that people see justice very differently. For some people, justice means to see their perpetrators behind the bar. Yes. For other people, justice means to get compensation, and without compensation, they feel unsatisfied. For some people, justice means a possibility to know truth, what happened with their beloved ones. For other people, justice means a possibility to be heard and to get public recognition that something which happened with them and their families is not just immoral, but illegal. So when we speak about justice, for me, it's a comprehensive strategy with different elements which reach all these needs. And also, for me, justice is a tool how to influence to present. Because a lot of people think that justice is only about past or future. About past because we prosecute someone for something which have already been done. For future, because it's a signal that if you will commit the same, you will be prosecuted as well. But justice has impact to present. What do I mean? Russians think that they will be unpunished. When we start decisive legal actions, even if part of Russians will have a doubt that probably this time they will not avoid responsibility, that this time they can't hide under figure of abstract Putin, that they have to be responsible for everything that they committed with their own hands and their own decision. If even part of Russians will have this doubt will be converted in chilling effect of brutality of human rights violations. And because we speak about ongoing war, it means that we can save thousands and thousands of lives.
Thank you so much for that. I think that comprehensive approach makes a tremendous amount of sense, especially given the sheer breadth of the crimes that you and your organization have documented and the sheer breadth of individuals that you've worked with and that kind of full scale or full continuum of what justice looks like to different people who have been impacted by this war. The kind of obvious follow-on question to that is how do we get there? The work that you're doing here, the work that you and your organization are doing in documentation, what would the structures look like to you to be able to provide that kind of full scale, full depth, full breadth sense of justice? It's
an excellent question. This question I ask to myself starting from March of 2022, I asked myself, for whom do we document all these crimes for? Who will provide justice for all people affected by this war? Because we face with accountability gap. What do I mean? International Criminal Court will limit its responsibility and its investigation only to several selected cases. It means that the vast majority of cases, like atrocities which Russian troops committed in Ukraine, will be still a responsibility of national legal enforcement and justice system. And for current moment, Office of General Prosecutor opened more than 140,000 criminal proceedings. Can you imagine this number? To have a responsibility to effectively investigate and prosecute, according to the whole international standards, 140,000 proceedings during the war, it's impossible even for the best national system in the world. Ukraine doesn't have the best national system in the world, so we need international assistance in it. So it's first problem. Second problem is that there is no international court which can prosecute Putin and his surrounding for the crime of aggression. But everything which we are documenting is result of their leadership decision to start this war. And this is even more important than that, because if we want to prevent wars in the future, we have to punish the states and the leaders who start such wars in present. It's a common sense. But in the whole history of humankind, we have only one such a precedent. It was Nuremberg trial. It was a trial where Nazi war criminals were tried only after Nazi regime had collapsed. And that is why a lot of politicians and people who take decisions, they still look to the world through the lens of the Nuremberg trial. And they say, let's wait when and how this war will end. But we live in a new century. We cannot wait. Justice must be independent of the fact when and how the war will end. We have to establish a special tribunal on aggression now and hold Putin, Lukashenko, and top political leadership and high military command of the Russian state accountable.
I want to get back to what you mentioned about the sheer quantity of prosecutions, because there's been quite a bit written about the overnight necessity of a massive expansion of war crimes and criminal prosecutions. But I do want to touch on something you just said before I go back to that, and that is the Nuremberg trials vis-a-vis the sheer quantity of prosecutions going on in Ukraine right now. One of a comment, I don't know about a criticism that's been made about the Nuremberg trials over the year, as you mentioned, is a sense of victor's justice. The Nazis were thankfully taken out of power, and then there were these trials for senior leadership. How is the state of Ukraine doing with prosecuting Russian soldiers, ensuring that they are granted human rights protections, they're subject to the rule of law, to avoid this kind of victor's justice?
It takes a lot of efforts because we want justice, not revenge.
Yes.
And we want equality for future generations, because this war has not just military, but also informational dimension. And everything which we experience, according to historians, this commemorative memory will disappear just in 3 generations. And only senses remained, which was fixed, which was reflected, and which was proved. So it's historical obligation to do everything according to the standards, not to have any doubt in future what happened. And this is difficult to uphold. And we see the attempt of national investigation bodies and justice system to do it. But this is also an explanation why we have 140,000 cases and only 300 hearings in the Ukrainian court, because you have a limited capacity to guarantee it all, to fulfillment all the standards.
Definitely, and I think we can certainly all understand the difficult dichotomy of that. There can be no more kind of moral difficulty than seeing and having well-documented atrocities that were committed, wanting nothing but, punishment for that, but standing up for the rule of law, standing up for human rights, even when you're quite aware that these crimes have been committed and terrible things have been done. On the 140,000 cases that you mentioned, what's your assessment so far? I mean, it's incredibly difficult, but how do you think that the Office of the Prosecutor General is doing? As you mentioned, it would be unbelievably difficult for even the most advanced rule of law system to all of a sudden have this influx of criminal cases. Do you think that things are working well? Do you think that things are working well but could be better? Do you think that there are improvements that could be made?
Things always can be better, and we always need improvement. But what I want to acknowledge is that this is the most documented war in the human history.
Yes.
And I still think that Ukrainian case can change the global approach to war crime justice, and other people in the similar situation will benefit from this. What do I mean? Now we have digital instruments and new technologies which provide us an opportunity to restore what happened, to identify perpetrators, to collect evidence, to communicate with people from occupied territories, which we can't even dream of 30 years ago during the Balkans War. The work of Bellingcat and other investigators convincingly proved that very often, in order to analyze and to restore events, there is no necessity even to be on the spot. We also use not just testimonies of victims and witnesses, not just mobile groups who work in the occupied territories on the ground, but also open data with a further verification to understand is it false or not. And this provides us enormous opportunity to change this sad norma, which was previously that when you have wars or huge human rights crisis, like authoritarian regimes start massive persecutions against its own citizens, because of the large number of crimes, vast majority have no chance to justice, because it's difficult to individually track each story. We can challenge this norma. We have new technologies which provide us this opportunity. The problem is, with our ambition, we're still thinking from the past categories. And with our legal infrastructure, which not so rapidly changed as new technologies, but it means that we have just additional tasks to change it. So I want to focus on this because we know that in different parts of the globe, people also fighting for human rights and for their freedoms, and they face with different kinds of international crimes. And with our tragedy, we can design a new principles, new tools, new instruments, and new approaches how to help them also to achieve justice.
I think that's an enormously important point, and I'd like to reiterate for the folks watching, the growth of technology surrounding documentation is absolutely incredible for this war. I mean, we're seeing it in live time. I'll say, as I was preparing for this conversation, I was reading about chatbots that your Office of Prosecutor General are using to allow people who are submitting evidence to categorize that evidence. This is for this war crime, this is for this war crime, this is for that geography. Traditionally, that's been such a difficult process. It's been so manual. It's required so many person hours that just being able to do that is unbelievably impressive and unbelievably important. I'd also say it probably helps with, as you were talking about earlier, the full scale, full continuum, full breadth of justice. Part of that is agency. Part of that is having a voice, exactly as you said. And I mean, being able to contribute to the prosecution through evidence an individual provides, and them knowing it is going to this crime in this location, that has to help an individual feel as though they have their voice back.
Yes, this and other kind of tools, they help to restore what happened. But still, when we go deeper as a lawyer, we understand that we have problems, because you can't use the evidence which you get like this in national and international court, because you have this admissibility criteria, and this also pushes us as a lawyers to rethink. Probably in our post-informational world, we have to change something in this criteria to be able to use this evidence for one side, and for another side, we have to make additional criteria, because you can easily create deep fake.
Absolutely.
Now we have technologies with just several seconds of your voice. They can make the whole conversation, and even you yourself can't understand is it your voice or not. So we have to change legal approach according the boost of new technologies. But like the one example of positive using technologies, we together with our partners, International Federation for Human Rights, submit a report to International Criminal Court. We ask them to open the new criminal case against Russian propagandists, because they commit not just propaganda thing, their words kills. Their words kill. And we ask to open a case based on crimes against humanity, because they encourage Russians to commit such kind of crimes with this inciting hatred and form the image of enemy from like ordinary Ukrainian. And in order to prepare this report, we analyze a huge amount of video, a huge amount of text, which produced for all these years by these Russian propagandists like Simonyan or Kiselov or others. And if we have to do it like personally, it will take years just to listen. But now we have new technologies like programs which make it happen without waiting for years.
That's extremely helpful. I mean, I know there's tremendous history with prosecuting propagandists in these situations. You know, we spoke earlier about Nuremberg, Rwanda as well, where people who use mis and disinformation or just broadcasts to point violence are held accountable. So that'll be an unbelievably important thing to follow. I do want to pull on this kind of mis and disinformation thread, because I think it's really, really important. One of the more troubling things that we're seeing globally in this broad trend of, you know, outgrowth of authoritarianism, democratic backsliding, whatever one wants to call it, is malign actors, folks like Putin, working with other malign actors. You already mentioned Lukashenko. And in this setting, we're seeing cross-learning. We're seeing efforts that are done by one, picked up by the other, improved, you know, gone back. One of the best answers that I've seen, and please correct me if you disagree, but to that is for similar cross-learning from folks fighting for democracy and human rights. Similar, how do we counter this? How did you counter that? You've traveled a lot in your role, working with the center. You have been working a lot with, you know, American organizations. You just mentioned the International Federation for Human Rights, which is a European organization. What have you learned that you think you can apply to the work that you're doing in Ukraine from others who are fighting for democracy and human rights or documenting war crimes elsewhere?
I don't know how historians in future will call this historical period, but we happen to live in a very challenging time. And the whole international order, which is based on UN Charter and international law, is collapsing before our eyes. We have to start a cardinal reform of international system, because it's not provide human rights guarantees and security for people and can't protect them against authoritarianism and the wars. And parallel, we see the formation of entire authoritarian bloc. Like, let's take Ukrainian example. I live in Kyiv, and my native city is constantly being shelled, not just by Russian rockets, but also by Iranian drones. China helps Russia to circumvent sanctions and import technologies critical to warfare. North Korea sent to Russia more than 1 million artillery shells and plan to deploy their troops to fight in this war against Ukraine. And Syria votes for Russia in UN General Assembly. All these regimes which captured power in their countries, they have something in common. They see from one perspective what a human being is. They see a human being as an object of control. They deny people in their rights and freedoms. Democracies see human being, their rights and freedom to be the highest value. And there is no way to negotiate it, because only existence of free world always provide dictatorship a threat to lose their power. So my main lessons learned why I see these different battles in different parts of the globe is that if authoritarian countries support each other, we, democracies, and people who believe in democracy and human rights have to support each other even stronger, because it's our common battle, because freedom has no limitation in national borders, because only spread of freedom make our world safer.
I agree completely, and I would say that I think that that's probably the best description of the difference between democracies and authoritarian governments I've ever heard, so thank you for that. Seeing human beings as an object of control versus seeing human beings as the highest value. That's just wonderful to hear, and I'm glad it's been something that has cut across your conversations with other human rights activists, other democracy activists, as you've been doing this work. I want to change gears a little bit and talk about the work you and your organization did prior to, definitely prior to 2014, but also at a larger scale prior to 2022, which is this kind of democracy deepening, human rights protection work that was both domestic in Ukraine, but also focused on OECD countries. First, can you talk a little bit about that work and kind of how you got into it originally?
I started my human rights work being a student, and I started to be interested in this work being children in school. It was a time when I got acquaintance with Soviet dissidents. Dissident movement, it was movement of intellectuals in Soviet Union. Journalists, writers, engineers, physics, math specialists, like different kinds of knowledge. And it were people who say what they think and do what they say, who had a bravery to stood up their voice against the whole totalitarian Soviet machine. They have no other tools, just only their own words and their own position. And they use their own words and their own position with dignity. And dissident movement was severely persecuted in Soviet Union. Part of people were killed, part of people were forced for forcible psychological treatment in hospitals. Others were imprisoned, all their careers were ruined, families were separated, but they didn't stop. And being a child, I was so inspired by this example that I decided myself to study law and to continue this fight for freedom and for human dignity.
That's wonderful, and it makes total sense. Coming off that, I guess what I'd ask is, now you've found yourself somewhat thrust into a national security conversation. And one of the conversations we always have with the Human Rights Initiative here at CSIS is about how vital human rights are to the national security conversation.
Oh, yes.
Can you talk about how you found that experience, that understanding, that belief in individual freedom, human rights, either lending to or being a part of this national security conversation that you find yourself, and forgive me if I'm stating this wrong, but somewhat unintentionally, certainly not through your own actions, being a part of this national security conversation?
It's a very good question, because for years I heard that human rights and freedom is important, but economic benefits, security issues, geopolitical interests are much more important. And for years we see how even developed democracies close their eyes for what Russia is doing. First, Russia destroyed their own civil society step by step, and nobody made a real reaction to this, because Russia killed journalists, detained activists, dispersed peaceful demonstrations, but the world turned blind-eyed because Russia has oil and gas. Then we see that Russia committed horrible crimes in different countries, and once again even developed democracies continued to shake Putin's hand, build gas pipeline like Germany, do business as usual with Russia. And now we have what we have, because the truth is that human rights and peace, like security, are inextricably linked. And when you base your political decision only on economic benefits, security concerns, geopolitical interest, and ignore human rights and freedom, even if you benefit in short term, we all await for catastrophe in long term. So now we're in a world which we created with our irresponsible approach, because we encourage evil to grow.
I couldn't agree more, and thank you so much for saying that. And I do think it goes back to something you had previously said about the current situation in Ukraine and how impunity in the 2014 incursion, really led to an exponential growth in what happened in 2022 and what continues to happen. So I think that a huge part of this conversation that is vitally important, that you've raised a number of times, is the connections between impunity and human rights and aggression, conflict, the violence of harsh dictatorships. So I thank you for raising that. I also wanted to say, here in DC, you've been doing a few of these kinds of discussions. We tend to have a conversation that is based around what can governments do, sometimes what can international organizations do. Should the US government be giving X amount of money to assist in the situation? Obviously there are a wide array of stakeholders, and I just wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about how the private sector or civil society, even individuals who might be watching at home, are able to contribute to the fight that you guys are all undergoing.
Let me first to provide a context why we have to react, because it's not just a war between two states. This is a war between two systems, authoritarianism and democracy. And with this war, Putin attempts to convince the entire world that democracy, freedom, human rights, and rule of law are fake values, because they couldn't protect anyone during the war. Putin attempts to convince that the country with a strong military potential and nuclear weapon can break the world order, can dictate its rules to entire international community, and even forcibly change the internationally recognized borders. And if Putin succeeds, it will encourage other authoritarian leaders in different parts of the globe to do the same. And we can find ourselves in a world which will be dangerous for everyone without any exception. In this regard, Ukraine is not a goal. Ukraine is a tool which Putin and his authoritarian allies, Iran, China, North Korea, Syria, and others, use in order to break international order, to destroy human rights guarantees, to withdraw our security, which people in developed democracies taken for granted. And that is why we have to react. Because it's much bigger picture than just Russia and Ukraine. It's about our common future. It's about world which we will want to have or don't want to have for us and for our children. And now it's this is the basis for the future world. And how this war will end will define this more broader perspective. What can to be done? A lot, still a lot. I will not go to detail, but let's start even from the main point. When large-scale war started, the civilized world told, let's help Ukraine not to fail. And Ukraine obtained the first weapons to be able to defend ourselves. And first real sanctions, finally, against Russia were introduced into force. And we're extremely grateful because it helped us to survive. But this narrative, let's help Ukraine not to fail, it's also an explanation why Ukraine was waiting for a first modern tank more than 1 year. And we lose a lot of people. Why Ukraine was waiting for a first modern plane for more than 2 years, and we lose a lot of people. Why are we still waiting for a lot of things? For example, a permission to strike back to military object on Russian territories and to hit drones, rockets on their territories, because it takes only 42 seconds for Russia to hit school in Kharkiv. And when you have only 42 seconds and your children in the school, you have a clear understanding that it's less time for your children to hide in bomb shelter, and probably in 42 seconds your children will be killed. So we're still waiting for decisive actions because we have to change the narrative. There is a huge difference between let's help Ukraine not to fail and let's help Ukraine to win. And the United States, just this country, has all capacity to make it happen. And we can practically measure this difference between let's help Ukraine not to fail and let's help Ukraine to win in types of weapons, in speed of decisions, in gravity of sanctions, and a lot of other things, which hasn't done yet.
I was planning on asking to let you conclude just what message would you like to convey to the international community, but I think the one you've just given is the best message that can be conveyed. That's a vitally important one and enormously appreciative. So I think we just have a few minutes left. So you touched on this a bit in the beginning, but I'd like to try to end on a bit of a positive note, the way that you ended your introduction. And I'd like to ask, you said in these times of immense turmoil, immense violence, immense aggression, you really have gotten a chance to see the best of people. You've really gotten a chance to see people coming together. You've really gotten a chance to see human beings doing wonderfully human things. I was wondering if you could, expand on that a little more. Maybe, tell us something that you've seen that even in the context of, horrible violence and war has really helped you continue your work, even though you're seeing such terrible things on a day-to-day basis.
I will tell the story of my colleague. Her brother was living for years and working in Germany. And when large-scale war started, he returned to Ukraine. And he was organized the evacuation for civilians from siege cities, because Russia has never allowed the International Committee of Red Cross to open green corridors for such evacuation. So they did this evacuation under Russian shelling. And her brother was severely injured, and he lost his legs. And his friends and his family in Germany organized transportation. He's still in Germany, he's still recovering. And his sister told me that, for sure, I don't want my brother to return to stop his peaceful life in Germany, separate with his family and risk his life. But you know, among people whom my brother saved was a small boy. His name is Dmitry. And this boy, he still writes beautiful messages to my brother. And when I read these messages, I told, thanks God that you saved them. So I want to say that despite everything, the story of Ukraine, it's a life-affirming story, because dramatic times raise hope. Because when freedom is denied, it becomes a powerfully breakout through the concrete individuals. And because we still have a chance to fight for our future, there is no guarantees, but this is a luxury to have a chance.
I think that's an incredible way to leave the conversation. I just want to say thank you again for being here. This has been absolutely wonderful, and thank you so much for all you do. Thank you all for watching at home. This has been Andrew Friedman from the Human Rights Initiative here at CSIS and Oleksandra Matviichuk from the Nobel Peace Prize winning Center for Civil Liberties. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.